The Most Loyal Servant, and the Betrayal over 10 years. Part 1: The Invisible Shadow. Who is the most dangerous person in your empire? It isn't the aggressive rival trying to crush you. It isn't the ambitious executive trying to steal your job. It is the quiet, boring assistant who has been making your coffee for 10 years without ever asking for a raise. Today, we decode the terrifying psychology of the 10-year betrayal. Richard Blackwood was the undisputed king of a multi-billion-dollar logistics empire based in Chicago. He was brilliant, aggressive, and deeply arrogant. Richard constantly fired ambitious executives because he saw their hunger as a direct threat to his throne. But there was one man who survived every single corporate purge: Thomas Hale. Thomas was Richard's chief of staff. For exactly 10 years, Thomas was practically invisible. He wore plain, cheap suits, drove a standard sedan, and never once asked for a promotion, a bonus, or equity in the company. He simply existed to make Richard's life perfect. He managed Richard's private emails, organized his highly classified offshore accounts, and remembered the favorite wines of Richard's elite board members. Richard bragged to his billionaire friends that Thomas was the ultimate loyal servant, a man with zero ego, completely happy to live his entire life in his master's shadow. Richard thought Thomas lacked the spine to be a leader, but he was catastrophically wrong. Thomas wasn't lacking ambition, he possessed a terrifying level of patience. While Richard was busy fighting external wars and crushing rival CEOs, Thomas was treating his 10-year tenure as a masterclass in corporate warfare. Every time Thomas quietly took notes in a classified meeting, he wasn't just recording minutes, he was documenting Richard's fatal operational flaws. He wasn't just fetching coffee, he was memorizing the precise psychological weaknesses of every single board member. Thomas didn't want a 10% raise. He didn't want a corner office. He was silently waiting for the exact right moment to take 100% of the entire kingdom. How does a brilliant, paranoid CEO become completely blind to a predator standing right behind him? In dark psychology, this is known as proximity blindness and the harmlessness illusion. Human beings are evolutionarily wired to detect sudden, aggressive movements. When someone submits to us completely, shows no ego, and makes our lives easier, our brain's threat detection system, the amygdala, completely shuts down. Richard's massive narcissism required a servant, so his brain categorized Thomas as a piece of furniture. You do not fear the chair you sit on, even if its legs are slowly breaking. The first law of power in corporate warfare: never confuse submission with loyalty. True loyalty is tested in the fire of disagreement. If a man spends a decade standing silently in your shadow, never complaining and never asking for a crown, he isn't content. He is simply waiting for you to close your eyes so he can take yours. Part 2: The Parasitic Vine. How do you steal a billionaire's army without him ever noticing? You don't bribe his generals with gold. You simply listen to them when the king refuses to. Today, we decode the dark art of tactical empathy and the theft of a power network. Richard Blackwood's true power wasn't just his logistics infrastructure, it was his elite network. He held the private numbers of senators, global banking CEOs, and aggressive supply chain tycoons. Richard guarded this network fiercely. However, Richard was also a notorious tyrant. He screamed at bankers, insulted his own board members, and completely ignored their personal lives. As chief of staff, Thomas Hale was the ultimate gatekeeper. Every time Richard aggressively hung up the phone on a powerful ally, Thomas would quietly make a follow-up call. Thomas would apologize on Richard's behalf, offering a calm, soothing voice. When a board member's child was sick, Richard didn't care, but Thomas remembered to send a handwritten card and rare flowers. When a key investor was nervous about a deal, Thomas would sit with them for hours over cheap coffee, validating their concerns and making them feel heard. Richard genuinely believed Thomas was just being a good secretary, cleaning up his messes to keep the business running smoothly. Richard thought Thomas was maintaining these relationships on behalf of the company. He was catastrophically wrong. Thomas was mathematically rerouting their emotional loyalty directly to himself. Over a decade, Thomas didn't just copy Richard's elite contact list, he completely hijacked it. Whenever Richard was brutal, Thomas was kind. Whenever Richard was arrogant, Thomas was humble. By the end of the 10th year, The politicians, the bankers, and the board members no longer trusted Richard, they trusted the quiet, reliable man standing behind him. Without stealing a single dollar, Thomas had effectively become the emotional owner of Richard's entire multi-billion-dollar network. How does a plain assistant steal the loyalty of billionaires? In dark psychology, this is known as tactical empathy combined with the contrast principle. Thomas weaponized Richard's toxic personality. By standing directly next to an arrogant tyrant, Thomas's basic human decency appeared incredibly heroic. When a victim is emotionally abused by a predator, Richard, their brain forms an intense, traumatic bond with anyone who offers them immediate comfort. Thomas didn't need to be wealthy or powerful to win their loyalty. He only needed to be the psychological safe haven from Richard's storms. The second law of power in corporate warfare. A contact list is just a piece of paper. True power lies in the emotional debt. If your servant is the one providing all the warmth, empathy, and respect to your closest allies, those allies no longer belong to you. They are just waiting for the servant to give the order to mutiny. Part 3: The Keeper of Sins. What is the fastest way to acquire a ruthless billionaire's darkest secrets? You don't hack his servers. You don't pick his locks. You simply wait for him to ask you to hide them. Today, we decode the fatal mistake of narcissistic delegation. Richard Blackwood's logistics empire was massive, but it wasn't entirely legal. To crush his competitors and maintain aggressive profit margins, Richard frequently utilized offshore shell companies, bribed supply chain regulators, and engaged in borderline tax evasion. As the federal authorities began to quietly audit the logistics industry, Richard realized he needed a firewall. He needed a disposable, fall guy, to put his name on the high-risk, illegal corporate documents. He didn't choose his elite lawyers. They were too smart and would demand too much money for the risk. He chose Thomas Hale. Richard genuinely believed Thomas was too timid, too simple-minded, and too blindly loyal to ever read the fine print or question the paperwork. Late one evening, Richard dropped a massive stack of classified documents onto Thomas's desk, casually ordering his chief of staff to become the sole legal signatory for a new, highly questionable offshore holding firm. Just sign where the tabs are. Tommy, don't worry your head about the details, Richard said, patting him on the back. Thomas bowed his head, smiled meekly, and signed the documents without a single word of hesitation. Richard walked away, laughing at how easy it was to use his good soldier. But Thomas wasn't just blindly signing papers. Every night, long after Richard had taken his private helicopter home, Thomas stayed in the dark office. He meticulously scanned, decrypted, and archived every single piece of illegal correspondence, tax fraud evidence, and bribery receipt. He cross-referenced the hidden accounts and backed them up on heavily encrypted offline servers. Thomas wasn't acting as Richard's disposable shield. He was methodically compiling a pristine, undeniable, multi-billion-dollar federal indictment dossier against his own boss. Why does a hyper-paranoid CEO hand his own death warrant to a subordinate? In dark psychology, this is known as narcissistic delegation and the liability trap. Narcissists like Richard view submissive people as objects rather than autonomous threats. Richard equated Thomas's silence with stupidity. He believed that because Thomas never challenged him, Thomas lacked the cognitive capacity to orchestrate a betrayal. But in the game of power, forced complicity is the ultimate form of leverage. Richard thought he was making Thomas legally vulnerable. In reality, he was voluntarily giving Thomas the gun, the bullets, and the exact coordinates to his own heart. The third law of power in corporate warfare. The dirt you force your servant to carry is the exact mud they will use to bury you. Never make a quiet, overlooked man the guardian of your worst sins. The moment you give someone the power to destroy you, assuming they are too weak to use it, you are no longer the master. You are the hostage. Part 4: The Blindfold of Arrogance. How do you defeat an undefeated general? You don't destroy his army. You simply put a blindfold over his eyes and let him confidently march himself off a cliff. Today, we decode the terrifying power of information control and the illusion of reality. Richard Blackwood was preparing for the crowning achievement of his career, a massive, multi-billion-dollar hostile takeover of his biggest rival, Apex Freight. To execute a merger of this magnitude, Richard required perfectly accurate market intelligence. However, a CEO of his status didn't read raw data, his ego was too big. And his schedule was too packed. He relied entirely on his chief of staff, Thomas Hale, to filter thousands of daily emails, risk assessments, and forensic audits into concise, single-page executive briefings. For weeks, Richard aggressively pushed the merger forward. He felt invincible because every single briefing Thomas placed on his mahogany desk confirmed that Apex Freight was highly profitable and ripe for the taking. Richard praised his own genius, completely unaware that he was standing on a landmine. Apex Freight wasn't a gold mine, it was a sinking ship. They were secretly drowning in toxic debt and facing an impending, crippling federal labor strike. Richard's elite risk analysts had actually discovered this fatal flaw. They sent urgent, red-flagged emails and detailed warning dossiers directly to the CEO's office, begging Richard to cancel the deal. But those warnings never reached Richard. Thomas intercepted every single one of them. Thomas silently deleted the urgent emails, shredded the physical risk assessments, and meticulously rewrote the executive summaries. He fed Richard a perfectly sanitized, highly optimistic lie. Thomas wasn't just hiding the truth, he was weaponizing Richard's arrogance, encouraging the CEO to over-leverage his entire empire to buy a worthless, toxic asset. How does a brilliant billionaire become completely blind on his own battlefield? In dark psychology, this is known as information gatekeeping and confirmation bias exploitation. Narcissistic leaders surround themselves with echo chambers. They deeply desire validation, not criticism. Thomas understood that Richard didn't want to hear that his grand strategy was flawed. By intercepting the negative reality and feeding Richard only the brilliant projections his ego craved, Thomas hijacked the CEO's perception of the world. He didn't need to argue with Richard, he simply altered the data to make Richard's suicide look like a victory march. The fourth law of power in corporate warfare: the one who controls the king's ears controls the kingdom. The greatest danger to a powerful leader is not the enemy in front of him, but the filter between his eyes and the truth. If your servant controls what you see, you are already completely blind. Part 5: The Golden Guillotine. What is the exact difference between a genius investment and a financial suicide? Exactly one signature. Today, we decode the psychology of the ultimate financial trap, and how a king eagerly buys his own guillotine. Richard Blackwood was ready to become a legend. To acquire Apex Freight, he needed $3 billion in liquid capital. Driven by Thomas's fabricated, hyper-optimistic briefings, Richard made the most aggressive gamble of his life. He didn't just use company cash, he took out massive, high-interest corporate loans, pledging 51% of his own controlling shares in Blackwood Logistics as collateral. He was betting his entire kingdom on a single hand of poker. Completely convinced the deck was stacked in his favor, Thomas quietly prepared every single page of the complex loan agreements, ensuring the legal covenants were airtight and utterly unforgiving. Richard signed the papers without reading the fine print, smiled at Thomas, and popped a bottle of $10 champagne to celebrate his supreme dominance. The champagne was still fizzing in the glass when the illusion shattered. At 6 a.m. the following morning, national news networks broke the story. Apex Freight wasn't just struggling, it had completely collapsed. A crippling, nationwide federal labor strike halted Apex's entire supply chain, exposing billions in hidden toxic debt. Apex's stock price plummeted by 90% in minutes. Richard hadn't bought a gold mine, he had bought a burning building. And because he had pledged his own controlling shares as collateral to fund the disastrous purchase, the mega banks immediately triggered a ruthless margin call. Richard was legally obligated to pay back the $3 billion immediately, or instantly forfeit his empire to the creditors. How does a billionaire walk so blindly into total ruin? In dark psychology, this is known as over-leveraged arrogance and the commitment trap. Thomas knew that narcissistic predators cannot resist the allure of a legendary victory. By isolating Richard from the negative truth and feeding his grandiosity, Thomas manipulated Richard into violating the golden rule of finance: never cross-collateralize your core foundation. Thomas didn't push Richard off the cliff, he simply built a beautiful golden bridge that led straight to a financial abyss. knowing perfectly well that Richard's massive ego would force him to sprint across it. The fifth law of power in corporate warfare: never use your throne as collateral to conquer a new kingdom. The most lethal traps on the battlefield are not the ones your enemies push you into. They're the ones you eagerly lock yourself inside, blinded by the blinding light of your own ambition. Part 6: The Federal Guillotine. How do you ensure a king cannot escape a burning castle? You don't just lock the front door. You wait for him to run toward his secret escape tunnel. And you fill it with federal agents. Today, we decode the dark art of the inescapable checkmate. The margin call was a death sentence. Richard Blackwood had exactly 48 hours to produce $3 billion in cash, or Wall Street banks would legally seize his entire logistics empire. Panic consumed him. He paced his mahogany war room, screaming at his lawyers, but there was no legal way out of the ironclad loan agreements Thomas had drafted. Desperate, Richard resorted to his final, most dangerous lifeline: his illegal offshore slush funds. He turned to Thomas, his quiet, invisible chief of staff. "Tommy," Richard barked, sweating through his custom suit, "liquidate the Cayman holding firms. Wire the black money back into the main corporate accounts immediately. It's our only way to pay the banks. Do it now." Richard smiled, believing his ruthless criminality was about to save his kingdom. Thomas calmly sat at his desk, adjusted his cheap glasses, and typed on his encrypted laptop. But he didn't initiate a wire transfer. Instead, he pressed send on an email addressed directly to the director of the FBI's white-collar crime division. Attached to that email was the pristine, multi-billion-dollar federal indictment dossier Thomas had been secretly compiling for years: every bribe, every tax evasion, and every illegal offshore account, all bearing Richard's ultimate directives. Thomas closed his laptop and looked up at Richard with a terrifyingly blank, empty expression. "I'm afraid I can't do that, Richard," Thomas whispered softly. "The Department of Justice just froze those accounts." Before Richard could even process the betrayal, the elevators dinged, and dozens of armed federal agents flooded the executive floor. How do you perfectly destroy a paranoid predator? In dark psychology, this is known as the savior-executioner reversal and legal sabotage. Richard's massive ego blinded him to the most basic rule of survival: you cannot rely on the person you exploited to save you from a crisis. Thomas engineered the financial collapse, the Apex Freight merger, specifically to force Richard into a state of blind desperation. He knew Richard would try to use the illegal funds as a last resort. By striking at the exact moment Richard reached for his secret weapon, Thomas transformed Richard's only escape route into a federal prison sentence. The sixth law of power in corporate warfare: your greatest secret weapon becomes your suicide vest the moment the detonator is held by someone else. Never expect the servant you forced to carry your sins to save you from the flames. The ultimate checkmate is when your only path to survival is paved entirely with your own crimes. Part 7: The Empty Throne. What happens to the throne the moment the arrogant king is dragged away in chains? You don't leave it empty, you sit in it while the seat is still warm. Today, we decode the dark art of the power vacuum, and how to legally inherit a stolen empire. The image of billionaire Richard Blackwood being hauled out of his Chicago headquarters in FBI handcuffs broke national news within minutes. Total chaos consumed Blackwood logistics. Wall Street panicked. The mega banks immediately executed their margin calls, legally seizing Richard's 51% controlling equity. The company's stock cratered. Inside the corporate boardroom, the elite directors were paralyzed by terror. They were terrified of being implicated in Richard's federal crimes and desperate to stop the bleeding. They needed a savior, a CEO who was legally clean, who deeply understood the company's complex operations, and who could negotiate with the ruthless Wall Street bankers to prevent a total liquidation. They didn't have months to search for an outside executive. They needed someone today. The board and the bankers didn't look outside the building. They turned to the one man who had been their quiet, empathetic confidant for a decade: Thomas Hale. Because Thomas had meticulously avoided putting his signature on any illegal documents, delegating that back to Richard or destroying his own trails, the FBI cleared him completely. He was the innocent, loyal secretary, but Thomas was ready to strike. utilizing the deep emotional loyalties he had hijacked from the bankers and board members over the last 10 years. Thomas proposed a rescue plan. He convinced a syndicate of friendly investors to buy Richard's seized 51% equity from the banks at rock-bottom panic prices. The head of that new private equity syndicate? Thomas Hale. In less than 72 hours, Thomas didn't just take Richard's corner office, he legally purchased the majority ownership of the entire multi-billion-dollar empire for pennies on the dollar. How does a plain assistant become the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company in 3 days? In dark psychology, this is known as crisis transference and the engineered vacuum. In times of extreme panic and chaos, human beings regress. They do not look for the smartest or most aggressive leader, they desperately seek the most familiar, calming, and stabilizing presence. By secretly orchestrating the catastrophic federal crisis, Thomas engineered a massive power vacuum. Because he had spent 10 years positioning himself as the only safe harbor for the board and the bankers. Their psychological dependency naturally transferred the crown to him voluntarily. The seventh law of power in corporate warfare. You do not need to conquer the castle if you are the one holding the fire extinguisher when it burns. The most flawless hostile takeover is convincing the terrified guards that you are the only one who can save them from the fire you secretly started. Part 8: The Mirror of Ruin. What is the absolute worst moment of a predator's life? It isn't the moment he is caught. It is the exact, agonizing second he realizes the harmless prey he ignored was actually the hunter who trapped him. Today, we decode the dark psychology of the retrospective awakening. Richard Blackwood was sitting in a cold, concrete federal holding cell in downtown Chicago, denied bail due to his massive offshore resources. The former billionaire had spent 3 weeks pacing his 6-by-8-foot box. He blamed everyone. He blamed his lawyers, the ambitious federal prosecutors, and his incompetent risk analysts. He demanded his legal team bring him the court discovery files to find the corporate leak. When his lawyer finally slid a thick stack of printed evidence through the visitation glass, Richard frantically began to read. He was looking for a highly paid trader. He didn't find one. Instead, he found the routing numbers, the deleted Apex freight risk warnings, and the perfectly documented FBI dossier. Every single piece of digital evidence was time-stamped and routed from the exact computer terminal located right outside his office door. Richard stopped breathing. He looked at the bottom of the federal indictment. The primary cooperating witness, granted full, untouchable federal immunity, was his plain, invisible, 10-year chief of staff, Thomas Hale. Richard finally put the pieces together. The catastrophic Apex freight merger, the shredded risk emails, the perfectly timed freezing of his offshore accounts. It wasn't bad luck. It was a flawless, 10-year mathematical equation. Thomas hadn't just watched Richard fall, he had engineered the cliff, built the trap, and gently pushed Richard over the edge, all while making his morning coffee. Richard wasn't the victim of a federal crackdown, he was the punchline of a decade-long joke. How does a genius finally process a total betrayal? In dark psychology, this is known as retrospective pattern recognition and ego collapse. Narcissists like Richard possess massive egos that block out contradictory information. For 10 years, Richard's brain refused to recognize Thomas as a threat because acknowledging a superior rival would shatter his self-image. But when stripped of his wealth, his yes men, and his freedom, Richard's ego defense mechanisms broke. In the sterile silence of the prison cell, his brain was finally forced to retroactively process the raw data. The realization that he was entirely outsmarted by his own, inferior, servant caused a complete psychological collapse. The eighth law of power in corporate warfare. The most dangerous assassin is the one who lives in your blind spot. If you believe you are the smartest person in the room, you are the easiest mark to con. Arrogance does not protect you. It simply provides the perfect camouflage for the person quietly plotting your demise. Part 9: The Velvet Glove. What is more terrifying than a tyrant who screams at you? A dictator who smiles warmly while he holds your entire life in his hands. Today, we decode the dark psychology of benevolent dictatorship and the terrifying rule of the velvet glove. The transition of power was seamless. Thomas Hale was officially the CEO of the newly rebranded Hale Logistics. The corporate board and the Wall Street bankers, deeply traumatized by Richard's explosive anger and federal crimes, breathed a massive sigh of relief. They expected Thomas to be a weak, easily controllable figurehead. At first, Thomas played the part perfectly. He kept the door to his executive office wide open. He didn't yell. He remembered everyone's birthdays and implemented generous mental health days. The corporate culture shifted from a war zone to a sanctuary. The executives loved him. They felt safe. But the honeymoon phase ended during a highly contested Q3 board meeting. A senior vice president, feeling emboldened by Thomas's soft nature, aggressively challenged Thomas's new expansion strategy, slamming his hand on the table just like Richard used to do. The room held its breath, expecting Thomas to either back down or scream. He did neither. Thomas took a slow sip of his tea, smiled gently, and looked the executive dead in the eyes. "John," Thomas whispered, his voice incredibly soft and laced with fake concern. "You seem terribly stressed. How is your daughter doing at Stanford? I know the company's new executive tuition assistance program, the one I personally approved for you last week, was a huge relief. It would be a tragedy if the stress of this job forced you to step down and lose those benefits. Are you sure you disagree with the strategy?" The room went ice cold. John turned pale, swallowed hard, and immediately apologized, voting in favor of Thomas. Thomas didn't threaten his job. He politely threatened his family's financial survival with a smile. How do you rule an empire of sharks without ever raising your voice? In dark psychology, this is known as benevolent dictatorship and emotional extortion. Richard ruled by fear of his wrath, which bred resentment and eventually mutiny. Thomas ruled by weaponizing his kindness. He created a system where every executive's personal comfort, family benefits, and financial security were directly tied to Thomas's personal generosity. When a tyrant screams, you want to fight back. But when a loving father figure politely reminds you that he holds the keys to your daughter's future, rebellion feels not only dangerous but morally ungrateful. The ninth law of power in corporate warfare. The iron fist is most lethal when it is wrapped in a velvet glove. A loud king makes you fear for your life. But a quiet king makes you fear losing your comfort. It is infinitely harder to overthrow a master who successfully convinces the slaves that he is their savior. Part 10: The Mirror of the Usurper. What is the very first thing a master thief does after he successfully steals a kingdom? He fires the security guards. Today, we decode the terrifying paranoia of the usurper, and why the new king must systematically destroy his own reflection. Thomas Hale had successfully stabilized Hale Logistics. To manage his massive new workload, the Human Resources Department assigned him a new chief of staff, a young, highly intelligent man named Michael. Michael was the exact replica of a young Thomas. He was incredibly quiet, wore plain, cheap suits, worked late into the night, and anticipated Thomas's every need without ever asking for a promotion or public credit. Michael was the perfect, invisible servant. The corporate board heavily praised Michael, noting how much he resembled Thomas from a decade ago. They assumed Thomas would absolutely love having a loyal, submissive protege to mentor. For 3 months, Michael flawlessly managed Thomas's schedule, emails, and personal affairs, smiling meekly and keeping his head down. On a random Monday morning, without any warning, performance review, or severance negotiation, Thomas brutally fired Michael. He didn't just terminate his contract, he blacklisted the young assistant from the entire Chicago logistics industry. To replace him, Thomas intentionally hired an aggressively loud, deeply arrogant, and openly ambitious executive who constantly demanded bonuses, argued in meetings, and complained about his office size. The board was completely baffled. Why would Thomas, a man who built his empire on quiet efficiency, fire the perfect loyal servant and replace him with a loud, obnoxious narcissist? How does a master manipulator protect a stolen throne? In dark psychology, this is known as usurper's paranoia and mirror projection. Thomas understood a terrifying truth that Richard Blackwood never did. Loud, arrogant, ambitious people are completely predictable. You can always see them coming. You know exactly what they want, and you can easily control them with money and ego. But the quiet, submissive, invisible servant who seemingly wants nothing, that is the deadliest predator in the room. Thomas fired Michael precisely because Michael was flawless. Thomas was looking into a psychological mirror, recognizing the exact same patient, parasitic tactics he used to destroy his former boss. The 10th law of power in corporate warfare. A man who steals a crown through the shadows will spend the rest of his life terrified of the dark. Never hire your own reflection. The usurper knows that true danger doesn't scream your name to your face. It quietly makes your coffee while memorizing your weaknesses. Part 11: The Compassionate Execution. How do you kill a predator who is already locked in a cage? You don't poison his food. You let him beg for a drop of mercy. And then you politely pour it into the dirt. Today, we decode the dark psychology of the final discard. 2 years into his federal prison sentence, Richard Blackwood was a ghost. His multi-million-dollar legal defense had completely drained his remaining personal accounts. His wife was facing foreclosure on their family estate, and his daughter was about to be expelled from her elite university due to unpaid tuition. Completely broken and out of options, Richard swallowed his massive pride and requested a prison visitation from the one man who destroyed him, Thomas Hale. To Richard's surprise, Thomas actually accepted. Thomas flew to the federal penitentiary using Richard's former private jet. Sitting behind the thick, bulletproof glass, Richard broke down, crying uncontrollably. The former tyrant begged his former servant, "You won, Tommy. You have the company, the money, the power. I have nothing. Please, there is one hidden trust fund in Geneva. Just release it so my wife and daughter can survive. Show a little mercy." Thomas listened patiently, his face a mask of deep, genuine empathy. He nodded softly, his eyes looking incredibly understanding. "I completely understand, Richard," Thomas whispered warmly through the phone receiver. "As a father, knowing your family is losing their home must be absolutely terrifying for you." Thomas paused, letting the emotional validation sink in, before leaning slightly closer to the glass. "That is exactly why I had my lawyers legally seize the Geneva Trust Fund yesterday to cover the reputational damages your crimes caused Hale Logistics. The money is already gone. Have a peaceful afternoon, Richard." Thomas gently placed the receiver down, stood up, smoothed his expensive tie, and walked away, leaving Richard violently screaming and pounding his bloody fists against the soundproof glass. Why does a victor go out of his way to crush a defeated enemy's family? In dark psychology, this is known as the zero-sum domination and compassionate sadism. A master manipulator like Thomas does not leave loose ends, not even emotional ones. Richard hoped that Thomas's quiet, polite nature meant he possessed a moral conscience. But Thomas weaponized his empathy one final time. By speaking softly, validating Richard's pain, "I understand how terrifying this is," and then delivering a fatal financial blow. Thomas maximized the psychological trauma. He didn't just deny Richard the money. He mathematically engineered absolute hopelessness while maintaining the polite tone of a friendly customer service agent. The 11th law of power in corporate warfare. The most terrifying monsters do not roar when they kill you. They smile and wish you a good day. Never beg for mercy from the architect of your destruction. The person who spent a decade meticulously designing your execution will only view your tears as the final trophy of their victory. Part 12: The Eternal Loop. What happens to the master thief who successfully steals the crown? He sits on the throne, builds a fortress, and eventually forgets that he taught the rest of the world exactly how to break in. Today, we decode the terrifying cycle of power, and why the shadow always outlives the king. 5 years had passed since Richard Blackwood was locked in a federal cell. Thomas Hale had built Hale Logistics into an untouchable global behemoth. He was a brilliant, benevolent dictator who ruled with a velvet glove. However, the loud, arrogant assistant Thomas hired years ago eventually proved too incompetent to manage the complexities of a multi-billion-dollar empire. Thomas reluctantly needed a new chief of staff. Driven by extreme paranoia, Thomas vetted hundreds of candidates. He was looking for the impossible, someone highly competent, yet completely devoid of ambition. Enter Arthur. Arthur was in his late 20s. Wearing cheap, ill-fitting suits, he had an average resume, a remarkably submissive demeanor, and spoke in a quiet, hesitant whisper. For 6 months, Arthur managed Thomas's schedule flawlessly. working late into the night and never once asking for a raise, a bonus, or public credit. He was the perfect, invisible servant. Thomas, remembering his own dark tactics, decided to test Arthur. One evening, Thomas purposely left a highly classified, unsealed folder regarding his new illegal offshore accounts on his desk, and hid a micro camera in the bookshelf. He wanted to see if Arthur would snoop. Arthur walked into the office to deliver coffee. He saw the classified folder. Without hesitating, Arthur carefully closed the folder and locked it in a secure drawer to protect his boss's privacy. Never once glancing at the pages, reviewing the footage, Thomas smiled, finally taking a deep breath of relief. He had found a truly harmless, loyal servant, but Thomas didn't notice the reflection in the glass window. Arthur didn't need to open the folder. He possessed a flawless photographic memory, and had quietly memorized the exposed offshore routing numbers upside down in a fraction of a second. How does an apex predator fall into his own trap? In dark psychology, this is known as the arrogance of survival and the predator's blind spot. Thomas believed his extreme paranoia made him invincible. He thought that by setting a trap, he controlled the game. But a superior manipulator knows how to pass the test by perfectly acting out the desired result. The moment Thomas believed Arthur had passed the loyalty test, Thomas's amygdala shut down. He relaxed. He felt safe. By successfully breaking Thomas's paranoia, Arthur successfully reset the exact same proximity blindness that destroyed Richard Blackwood. The 12th and final law of corporate warfare: the throne is never owned, it is only rented. The man who kills the king through the shadows is destined to be killed by his own reflection. In the game of absolute power, the cycle never ends. There is always a quieter, more patient servant, simply waiting for you to close your eyes. Thank you for following the series, The Most Loyal Servant, and the Betrayal over 10 years. The cycle of absolute power never truly ends, it merely changes hands in the dark. If this masterclass in corporate survival opened your eyes, do not leave your defenses down. Hit the like button, subscribe to Dark Mind Society, and click the bell icon to fortify your mind against the predators hiding in plain sight. Question for the comments: if you were Thomas, would you have spared Richard's family? Or was the velvet glove execution the only way to secure the throne? Let us know down below. Stay vigilant, and we will see you in the next shadow.